Lately, I've been thinking about how some people who come from abusive homes, they become abusers, whereas others from similar or even worse environments grow into such precious, compassionate, loving men and women of God. Do you ever wonder why that is, or more accurately, how? I think that's an important question for us all because we live in a broken world, and therefore every human on the planet grows up in some degree of dysfunction. And the question is, how can we learn to live differently so that we're not acting out of our wounding, but instead are healing? And I thought about this as I was listening in my U version to the biblical accounts of the patriarchs. They were a dysfunctional, a hurtful bunch, y'all. Men having multiple wives who competed for their affection, mothers favoring one son while fathers favored the other, and encouraging their children to deceive the other parent, siblings wanting to kill one another. After generations of this, we get to a teenager named Joseph. Some of you might be familiar with his story, or at least the Hollywood version of it. To paraphrase, he was his father's favorite son, a sad fact that his dad made no effort to hide. Over time, his brother's deep soul wounds turned to bitterness and eventually murderous hatred. Well, one day they captured Joseph. They ripped off a fancy robe that symbolized their father's favoritism. They threw him in a 15 or so foot well, intended to leave him there to die until they saw a chance to make money and sold him into slavery. You can probably imagine how painful and terrifying that must have been for Joseph. And his life didn't get better for a long, long time. And in fact, it grew worse when his master's wife, once he's in slavery, his master's wife accused him of sexual assault, and he was thrown into an Egyptian prison, likely a dungeon. And honestly, had I been Joseph, I fear I would have become bitter towards my brothers and maybe towards life in general. I certainly would not have wanted to bless them decades later when they came to me looking for a handout, which is ultimately what occurred. But Joseph responded to his brothers with grace and love, which again makes me wonder how. How was it that his brother's pain turned to bitterness and such cruel actions, whereas Joseph seemed to rise above his pain to become such a radiant example of God's heart? Well, I believe Scripture reveals the answer when we follow his story. Again and again, we read that God was with him. Once in Egypt, where he lived as a slave, we read in Genesis 39, verse 2, the Lord was with Joseph so that he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. And then later, when he was thrown into prison, in verse 21, we read, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. And this reminds me of Psalm 27, verse 10, and this was written by a man named David. It states, though my father and mother forsake me, the Lord will receive me. And we could insert any relationship into this verse. Though my spouse abandons me, God will bring me close. Although my friend betrays me, God will take me up. And there's comfort in that. There's healing in that. While God's unconditional acceptance, it won't eradicate our pain, at least not this side of heaven. I believe it does help us to rise above the mess that caused it, to become someone completely different than those who hurt us. And while I don't know what our healing journey will look like, I do believe it will involve drawing close to the God who is continually drawing close to you, learning to recognize and to rest in his presence and his love.